My name is Mark Petrachko. I am a customer consultant for the corporate South and Western United States for Elsevier Engineering. Today's session is a very special one, as we have the honor and privilege to introduce Paul McPherson and Margaret Phillips, who present an enlightening topic, standards, why they matter, and how we work with them. Paul McPherson is an assistant professor of practice in mechanical engineering and technology in the Purdue Polytechnic Institute at Purdue University in West Lafayette, Indiana. Margaret Phillips is assistant professor of library science and engineering information specialist in the Purdue University Libraries and School of Information Studies at Purdue University, also in West Lafayette, Indiana. Later, Judy Salk, the director of product management for Engineering Village, will show how to search for and discover standards. Today's session will exceed our usual 30 minutes, so if you have to leave early, please feel free to reach out to your customer consultant or myself for a link to the recording of today's session. But before we get started, I'd like to do a brief poll and ask you to indulge us and answer the questions, because it'll give us a better feel for your familiarity with standards as well as Engineering Village. So if you'd be so kind to take the poll, we'd appreciate it. Okay, well, thank you to those who took the poll. We've got a little bit of a mixed attendees, and it's really exciting because there's a lot of great information that you'll be able to benefit from. So without any further ado, I'd like to hand things over to Margaret. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Mark, and welcome everyone. We're really excited to be here today to give a brief overview of standards and talk about standards at Purdue. So we're going to focus on how we integrate standards into our engineering technology classes after we do that brief overview, and also talk a little bit about standards collections and outreach at Purdue. But first, we wanted to tell you a little bit more about how we each work with standards. Again, I'm an assistant professor in the libraries at Purdue, and I focus on engineering and technology disciplines. And one of my roles is to lead our campus libraries' standards collections and standards outreach efforts. I work to integrate standards information literacy into engineering technology and libraries curricula. And I'm a member of the ANSI Committee on Education. That's the American National Standards Institute. And I also have standards as a research interest of mine. I focus on standards education research and standards collections research in libraries. And Paul?
Good afternoon, my name is Paul McPherson. I'm an assistant professor of practice in the Mechanical Engineering Technology program at Purdue University. After working in industry and using standards almost on a daily basis, I got back into the education realm. And so as an educator, it's my job to ensure that students not only understand what a standard is, but also how to utilize a standard as part of mechanical design, quality control, and other ways before they become a professional practitioner. And as such, part of my role in the department is to assess how MET students utilize standards for the ABET requirements. And then in addition to my role as a professor, I serve on two standards development committees and work to review what's being proposed and be a voting member. So what is a standard? So in short, a standard is a document that communicates an agreement. ASME provides a standard or a definition of a standard as a set of technical definitions and guidelines on how or how-to instructions for designers, manufacturers, and users. in essence, it's a way of holding companies accountable for the products or services that they deliver and ensuring that they follow that standard. So an example that we pulled out was SAE J918, which is about passenger car tire performance. And we felt like this was relevant because it would apply, it probably applies to everyone attending this session.
And so I'm going to take a moment and show you, how we would locate that standard at Purdue. So first I'm going to, hoping I'm sharing the right screen here. Yes, it looks like I am. So I'm going to go to our database, the Engineering Village. It had it open, but it looks like it had timed out. But this is Purdue's instance of Engineering Village. And so we know the standard that we're looking for. Paul had mentioned we're looking for that SAE J918. So I'm going to go ahead and just put that in the search tool here. And it's the first one that comes up, that passenger car tire performance requirements and test procedures. So Judy's going to talk more about Engineering Village and standards a little bit later, but I wanted to show you how this looks at Purdue and how we can, because we subscribe to the SAE Mobilis platform and stand on that platform, we can then seamlessly connect, and the Purdue user would be able to download the standard. And so let's take a look at what that standard looks like in more detail. Go ahead, Paul.
So part of what we try to teach the students is how to navigate a technical standard. And so one of the biggest struggles that I have with students right now is using the same vocabulary that they would find in the professional world. And so as we scroll down through this standard, first we find who made the standard, obviously, why it's important, but we find the scope, and the scope tells us what the standard is all about, what it pertains to, and we tell students this is really where you want to start, and whether to determine whether or not this is going to apply to their project. And then as we go on down, we see in section 3 there the definitions, and it's important that students walk through this section so that, again, they're speaking the same vocabulary that professional practitioners would be using when they enter the field. And so not just when they enter the field, but also as they scroll on down through the standard, they understand exactly what the publishers or the writers of this standard were intending them to mean or understand as they perform tests or as they look at diagrams throughout the standard. So this just kind of an overview of what we do as part of a class and trying to get students to recognize the important information. So as we go down through, students may utilize some of these tables and charts as part of their design projects or part of their testing. And they really have to understand not only the vocabulary there, but what all this data is telling them. And so that when they go and do their trial runs or they do their design, they ensure that it's actually meeting the requirements laid out in this standard. Okay. So the types of standards that exist in the professional world. So it's important that students understand that there's not just one category. So for example, we talk to them about company standards. So this would just be an internal standard to the company that they have developed for their product or their process, similar to maybe work instructions that you may be familiar with. De facto standards and then government standards. We don't really touch too much on those. I do have a lot of students sometimes get into government standards and regulations. So they get into the Code of Federal Regulations or CRFs. And what basically they need to understand is that CRF is just a technical standard with the force of law, right? So it has to be met with the product that it pertains to. But we typically get into the voluntary consensus standards. And so the voluntary consensus standards would maybe ASTM, ASME, SAE for some things, although a lot of SAE standards do also get adopted as Code of Federal Regulations, especially if it pertains to safety. But we get into the voluntary consensus standards and talk to them about how they're developed, why they're important, as well as the information behind them, because we have the most access to the voluntary consensus standards at Purdue for students. So that's where they're going to really be turning to for their mechanical designs and their testing. So the benefits of standards. So if you don't understand the benefit of standards, you may just let it pass by the wayside, not really want to know more about standards, but really it's the interoperability of parts. So I do a lot of automotive work, and I would hate to have to go and try to customize a battery or an alternator or something to that effect. So trying to make sure that those parts are interchangeable. Global trade. I've had several conversations with people about why standards are important globally, and the best example I can give is the life jackets, personal flotation devices on ships. Seems to be a hot topic at the moment, and making sure that from a global standpoint, everybody is on the same page as to what is required. Comparisons and safety. Safety is obviously a big one. Trying to get, especially mechanical engineering students, to always think about safety first when they do a design. So understanding what standards would impact that area. Dependability and quality, efficiency, innovation, and consumer confidence. Making sure that if you're a company and you're designing something, that your consumers feel comfortable buying your product because you have met a standard and it's been agreed upon by a consortium of people. And then reduce ambiguity. So the best example I can give there is the bulletproof vests between Army and police are have two different standards, and they use different terminology for the testing of each vest. And so that's been a big hot topic for ASTM lately, is trying to narrow that down and get one standard for all of the bulletproof vests that are out there. So trying to make it one language for everyone. So when we go into talking about how standards are developed, it's important to understand that the US has a very unique model of how standards come to fruition. So it starts with the people that are out doing the actual work. So the practitioners in industry, academia, and government, those parties that are involved or have some sort of stake in the game, they will volunteer or as part of their job be part of a standards development organization, or the SDO. And then those SDOs, those people come together as that committee, and they try to develop a standard. And then once they approve that standard, they then go to the American National Standards Institute to get it published if they want it as an American National Standard. Once it's at ANSI, ANSI actually serves as the U.S. representative to ISO. So if ANSI has published the standard and approved the standard, then if it's something that impacts the society globally, they would go to bat for the standards that were developed in the U.S. At the international level, or the International Standards Society. So whereas in other countries is really a top-down approach. So you have these the government entities are actually selecting the people to participate on a standards development committee or an organization, and then they actually try to figure out what would be the best standard for their country. And more times than not, if it's approved as a standards or as a standard for that country, it's going to go right up to the ISO level. And it's also important to note that anything that ISO adopts typically becomes a standard for all the other countries, because it's pushed downward instead of brought upward. So the practitioners, while they do have a say and they participate in the standards development organization, it's not necessarily voluntary. It's more dictated to them that they need to participate by the government.
So why is all of this important, for education? Well, in the US for engineering and many technology programs, there are accreditation requirements from ABET. ABET is formally the accreditation board for engineering and technology, and they have commissions that set criteria for various engineering and engineering technology areas. And their Engineering Accreditation Commission, we've listed the language that they have in their criteria, criterion 5, that overlaps with standards. They require a culminating major engineering design experience that incorporates appropriate engineering standards. And the Engineering Technology Accreditation Commission, or the ETAC, they have similar language in their criterion 5. And they additionally have language in their student outcomes criteria 3, where students are required to have an ability to conduct standard tests, measurements, and experiments, etc. And so those are the most closely tied criteria that have language to standards, but there are several other criterion that definitely overlap with standards if you consider that more broadly. So it's definitely very important from an accreditation perspective. Additionally, another reason it's really important is that we know from research that new hires and student co-op interns, they need to use standards on the job. Employers have expectations for standards use. In the first citation that's listed here, a survey by Jeffries and Lafferty, were at the University of Minnesota, it showed that industry standards were reported as the most common type of literature engineering co-ops needed to complete on-the-job tasks. And the second citation, which Paul McPherson, who's a co-presenter today, is a co-author on, their survey found that employers want new engineering and technology graduates to be proficient in understanding standards development and in finding and using standards before they are hired. So these are just two examples of how this is important to better prepare our students to transition into the workplace. And one of the ways that we've approached that at Purdue is we applied for some funding a few years ago from NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology. I, along with Paul McPherson, the co-presenter on this session today, as well as another Purdue colleague, we were awarded a grant from NIST to develop some standards education materials. So it's essentially a standards OER, or an open educational resource. And that project was titled Standards Are Everywhere, an Information Literacy Approach to Standards Education. But the OER that was produced, it consists of a set of tutorial modules that are designed to give students an introduction to standards. We call it a gentle introduction to standards. It also has a case study database that houses student-produced standards cases, and it's all wrapped in a badge platform. So students can earn and display micro-credentials on platforms like LinkedIn or other badge-compliant platforms to demonstrate that they have standards knowledge and expertise. And it's being heavily used at Purdue. Paul will tell you in a moment about how we use that in some of his courses, but it's been used by over 1,000 Purdue students to date in the mechanical engineering technology and also in the materials engineering program. And we do make the materials available openly, so you can go to that project website listed there and take a look, and see if any of them meet your needs. We do know that they have been adopted for use at other academic institutions and at other organizations. They're using them for intern training. And we did conduct a couple of workshops for other librarians and educators at the American Society of Engineering Education and at the Special Libraries Association conference. And those workshop materials are also available on that project website if you're interested. Now, Paul will tell us a little bit about how we integrate standards into his courses.
Yeah, so essentially, oftentimes standards get overlooked. So students may use a chart in the back of a book, or they may find a chart online, and they're using that as part of their process or their classwork. But what they don't understand is that those charts came from technical standards, and very rarely does the faculty member actually point out the fact that those come from technical standards. And so 6 years ago, when I started teaching at Purdue, actually I guess 7 years ago now, I wanted to change that, and so I developed the Standards Are Everywhere project for my MET 102 Production Design and Specification course. And so this class really focuses on mechanical design. And so for the past 6 years, Margaret and I have been working to really make this an interactive project for the students. And so what I do is I assign each student 3 common everyday items. So it could be the laptop that you're viewing this presentation on, it could be a cell phone, it could be the car tire that we talked about earlier. And what students have to do is they then have to go use our expansive databases and find 2 technical standards that relate to each item. And when they find those technical standards, they then have to develop a case study about one of those standards and tell us, how does that standard really impact the design, the testing, or the manufacturing of the item that they were assigned? And they can go a variety of routes. So if they had, for example, a toaster, they could choose the toaster as a whole, but they're probably not only going to find one standard about that toaster as a whole. And so they may choose to find a standard about the heating element or the electrical cord. And then they all have to be able to relate that back to the actual product of the toaster. And so, that's how we get them introduced to technical standards and introduced to how to search for standards and how to look through the standard to identify whether it's actually what they're looking for or not. So after we do the Standards Are Everywhere project, we continue on in the class with several mechanical designs. And as we progress through those mechanical designs, sure, I use charts in the back of a book, of your textbook, but in class, I actually pull up the technical standard that chart came from, and we talk about how to find the chart, what it is we're trying to accomplish with our design, and then we actually utilize the numbers on the chart to make our design. And that continues all the way to the final project in that class. And in that class, students have to design their own machine. And as part of designing their own machine, they actually have to go out and find the standards that may impact their machine design and talk about that in a final presentation and what standards they actually came up with and why those were important. In the advanced class, the MET 302 class, the CAD and the Enterprise, students, it's a very project-based course. So the students start out with an assigned project that they'll work all term on. And part of them completing that project is to have to look up standards and apply those standards as they build that project. And in that class, they not only design, but they also have to test. And so they get the whole gambit of design standards and trying to find testing standards. In the MET 451 Manufacturing Quality Control course, I actually utilize standards to teach students how to design go-no-go gauges or design jigs and fixtures to hold parts that have very tight tolerances. And for those, I pull everything from voluntary consensus standards all the way to publicly available company standards. And so students have to weed through those standards to figure out what applies to them based on the material of the product that they're using or the material that they're machining it out of. And so it really gets them to understand how a professional practitioner is going to have to, on a daily basis, look up technical standards to ensure that they're complying with the standard. And finally, the engineering technology capstone is, again, a very project-based course, but this time students are actually working with an outside entity for which they're designing and building and fabricating a machine or an instrument. And what we found is actually since we've integrated this project into the MET 102 course, one of the very first questions that the seniors are now asking the companies, the outside entities, is what standards do we have to abide by? And are those standards available on our database through Purdue, or is the company going to provide those standards? And then if the standard, for example, a testing standard requires a specific apparatus, how do we acquire that? How do we calibrate that? How do we make sure that it's actually doing what the standard says it's going to do? So it really comes full circle. So students typically take the MET 102 course in their sophomore year, and by junior and senior year, they're in the 302 course, the 451, and the engineering capstone. And so they're getting exposed to it every year that they're at Purdue, so that hopefully by the time they reach industry, they have a clue. They understand, and it's a natural process for them to be able to go and look through technical standards.
And so earlier I mentioned that I lead our library standards collections and our standard outreach efforts. And so we really do have a variety of standards users at Purdue. We have the students like in Paul's classes. And so I may work with instructors in classes to co-teach or co-develop standards lessons for students. Students also need standards for their research, undergraduate research projects or graduate research projects. So we make sure we promote standards for research as well. We also promote standards for teaching. So we have some other instructors who also, pretty heavily integrate standards into their courses and other disciplines. And faculty, of course, use standards for their research. So we try to promote what we have available and make people aware of the collections. We also have many staff that need to use standards at Purdue. So our facilities staff, like our engineering and architectural services units, the Wade power plant at Purdue, the nuclear reactor, our radiological and environmental management unit, they're all pretty heavy standards users that the library supports. And so we conduct trainings and I answer questions about our collections. Our collections are mostly electronic. And we encourage discovery through Engineering Village whenever possible, just because at Purdue, since we're set up with many publisher platforms like AIAA, ASCE, ASTM, IEEE, and SAE that seamlessly connect through Engineering Village, it's a great resource to start from when they need some of those heavily used collections. We do subscribe to some other aggregator platforms through IHS. We have their Engineering Workbench, and we also have some collections through TechStreet that either the publisher platforms, maybe we don't need all of the standards, or the publisher platforms in some cases don't work as well with our setup. So we have that available. We also try to purchase standards for users that we don't own or subscribe to currently when they need those, because we can't possibly subscribe to everything that one of our users might need. And so we try to, in those cases, add those to one of the aggregator platforms if we're able to. And we do maintain a small print collection too for some various needs. So if you're interested in learning more about some of our work, I've included a list of selected publications about some of our work with standards. In the first bullet point listed here, this is actually an upcoming paper that's been accepted to the Frontiers in Education Conference. And it focuses on analyzing engineering and technology job postings for new graduates. And it includes a discussion of how standards appear in job postings, how employers are indicating their expectations for new graduates to have experience, or to understand that they may be working with standards on the job through job postings. The fourth bullet point there, that's much more information about our NIST OER project, so if you're interested in that. And then last, Paul described the MET Everyday Standards assignment pretty thoroughly in the presentation, but if you want many more details, you can find them in that paper there. And we want to thank you all so much for joining our talk today. We really appreciate your interest. And so please put any questions you have in the chat box, and we'll look at them after Judy Salk's talk from Elsevier. So I'm going to hand it over to Judy now.
Thank you so much, Paul and Margaret. As Judy sets up her screen, I just want to remind you, if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A. We've got a few questions coming in. Again, I want to reintroduce Judy, who is the Director of Product Management for Engineering Village. She is an Elsevier treasure, and I want to turn it over to her. So Judy, please take over. Judy, you may have to come off mute.
Okay, am I here? Can you
Yes.
hear me? Okay, finally. I just gave my whole presentation and now I have to start over. No, just kidding here. So thank you, Margaret and Paul, for explaining to us why standards matter. They truly are everywhere in our lives, and we're very excited to be able to make them available in Compendex on Engineering Village. And you can see I've sort of stolen the theme from Purdue, Paul's class, standards are everywhere. So standards are everywhere, including in Engineering Village. And in this presentation, I'm going to show you how to search for them and discover them in Compendex, which is Engineering Village's flagship database. I can advance my slide. Okay, I'm not, sorry. I'm having a delay here, so there. All right, for those of you who are not familiar with Engineering Village, I just thought that I would show you the homepage for subscribers that subscribers see. It's a platform that aggregates multiple databases, and as I mentioned, Compendex is the flagship database, and that'll be our focus today. Most of the databases are what we call A&I services, in which vast amounts of content from all over the world are scanned and curated and selected and then indexed with specialized taxonomies that enable precise search discovery and recall of high quality and relevant content. And if you use the databases on Engineering Village and the features and functionality that are inherent in our search engine and the platform, you can find what you need, you can stay up to date, you can do that quickly, it will help you to understand new subject areas, identify collaborators, track competition, and you can rely upon it to enable you to not miss any content and to get your work done in little time and with the least effort possible. And I just want to show this slide. I'm absolutely not going to go through this slide. There's too much information here, but I did just want to show you that Compendex, the flagship database, which was known as the Engineering Index, has been in existence since 1884. It became a database in 1970, it became Compendex. So we've been indexing engineering literature for 136 years, and we've been documenting engineering feats, large and small, for all that time. Okay, so what's in Compendex? Again, just a quick overview. Currently, we have 27.5 million records in the front file. We call the front file 1970 to the present. We cover over 190 engineering subject areas. We cover many different document types. In this year, 2020, we reached our 25 million record milestone in February. It's also the 25th anniversary of Engineering Village and the 50th anniversary of Compendex, which is computerized engineering index. And so you can see that we cover quite a few different types of documents. For the longest time, we were indexing primarily scholarly journals and conference proceedings, but in recognition of the need of engineers to utilize and to be able to discover content that exists in many other sorts of documents, we started indexing dissertations and books, and hopefully the animation works here. I don't know why it doesn't. Okay, and standards. So that's what we're talking about today. So technical standards are easily searchable and discoverable alongside the engineering literature in Compendex. And, Margaret and Paul explained this really, really well, so I don't really need to go into this too much, but if you look on the left-hand side, you can see the standard development organizations with which we're working now. Hereafter, I'll refer to them as SDOs. We have a lot of the big ones, IEEE, ASTM, SAE, and so forth. We also, years ago, in what we call the EI back file, 1884 to 1969, were also indexing standards, not to the same extent as we are doing now and not with the depth of content that we are doing now, but you'll find about 7,900 records that are from standards, also in the EI back file. And if you look in the lower right-hand corner of the slide, you'll see we have some other SDOs in the pipeline for hopefully this year, still Q3 and Q4. And so, you know, the point I want to make here is that the standards are sourced directly from the SDOs, and we endeavor to index all versions and all statuses of the standards that have been produced by these SDOs, so active and inactive standards. And where there are references, we'll show those. And you know, our main goal is to be able to provide links to full text. We're not hosting the standards on Engineering Village, but we are linking off to them wherever they're hosted. Normally, that would be on the SDO's site. And of course, as has been explained to you, standards are used by engineers in academia, corporate, and government domains. And so we're hoping that standards found in Compendex are used by all those different sorts of customers that we also have. So in terms of the metadata that we capture, you know, we capture the standard title, the standard ID, an abstract. The abstract can often include the scope, which Paul described, and also the status of information about a standard, the DOI, which is a digital object identifier, or a URL, whatever will help us to link to the full text when it's available. It's not always available from the SDO, but when it's available, we're capturing it. An ISBN also seems to help quite a lot for certain link resolvers if you're using a link resolver, particularly in libraries. Also volume numbers. Sometimes standards are published in books, and so they have volume numbers. We will include the publisher name or the SDO name. It's the same. And the international classification for standards known as the ICS and other keywords, which also help us index the standards appropriately. So over on the right-hand side, you can see a standard. We'll actually be looking at this standard later on in my presentation, but this one is from SAE. And you can see that there's revision history, and then the related information is at the bottom, the DOI, you know, who the publisher is. Above you have the abstract. You also have keywords. So back to Engineering Village and how to search for it. So if you start in the most basic way, you have to choose a database. In this case, it'll be Compendex in quick search. And then I just decided to search on a word. I don't really know if it's a controlled vocabulary term or not. I'm going to find out if it is, but I decided I want to search on tires. And I'm really excited to see that Paul had that also in one of his examples. So we're on the same wavelength here, tires. And I get a pretty big result set here, 38,000 records. That's quite large, and that's too much for me to deal with. I'm probably now going to have to narrow down my search. And I can see that I have navigators or facets on the left-hand side, and I can filter my search results and limit my search results by using these navigators. I'm really excited to see here that tires is actually a controlled vocabulary term. So I know that if I want to get more specific and I only want to look at records that have been indexed with that as a controlled vocabulary term, then I will select tires from the controlled vocabulary facet. And since I have decided, you know, I would like to see the standards that relate to tires, I'll pick standards as a document type. And I can see that SAE International is one of the publishers. So I think I really am interested in knowing what sort of content that they're publishing in standards on tires. So I've selected all those. And then then it really narrowed down my search. See, I had over 38,000 records. Now I have 145. And you can see up at the top of the screen where I've circled the query, you can see what I've searched on. So I searched on tires within, you know, in general, within all, but then I narrowed it down to tires just that have been, to records that have been indexed with tires as the controlled vocabulary term. And then standards as a document type and SAE International as the publisher. And I got 145 records. And now I'm thinking still too many. And what I'm really interested in is alignment or aligning tires or some version of alignment. So I can add another term over in the left-hand side in the facets also, and I can search on that. And now I've gotten to 4 records, and I can see that these are standards about tires from SAE, and 2 of them are about alignment. And so, right, we'll come back to that. I'll show you what the record looks like, but I wanted to show you a few other ways to search as well. Also sorting. So I can sort on the oldest record. So you can see we have SAE standards going back to 1963 that are about tires. Actually, we have standards going back much farther than that, but this was about tires. I can also search on newest. I can search alphabetically, A to Z, on the source, on the publisher, and more. I could have conducted a search also if I knew the publisher that I wanted to search on. I could have just searched on the publisher name, SAE International, and started my search that way. I could have limited it right from here and limited it to standard as a document type. And, you know, I would have also found over 38,000 records doing it that way. And I can also search by the standard ID. If you know the standard ID, and lots of people do know that if they're used to working with standards all the time, I could search on the standard ID. And then this is a very specific search. I found the 1 record that, that is about that particular standard. So if we look at the record itself, you can see we have, you know, all this metadata, the source title, the standard ID, when it was published, you know, identifying it as a standard, who the publisher is, and then you can see the abstract, which describes it, and then indexing terms that we've assigned to help you search and discover the record, the standard. And we'll also capture references if they're there, and also the versions, which I'll show you in a moment. And over on the right-hand side, you can also see related documents, could be in journal articles or conference proceedings or in other databases on EV. And if you look at the versions, you can click on these and open up the record for any version, or you can click right here to the full text. I think also here you could click to the full text. And so when we click over to the full text, I don't have an entitlement to SAE Mobilis, but if I did, like Margaret showed you, then I would get into the record and I'd be able to see the full text and anything else that they're showing me about the standard. In this case, I still can link over and see quite a lot of the metadata, but here I'm offered an opportunity to purchase the standard through the SAE Mobilis site. And I did just want to mention that some standards, particularly ASTM standards, are announced out in the media when they come out. And so if that's captured, if that happens, then we may also have some Plum Metrics over here, which will show you that. I thought I had a Plum Metrics slide. Anyway, we'll show you where the mention is made, and you can investigate it further in the news or on a blog posting or somewhere else. And then I also mentioned before related documents. These can be very useful. So you can, you found a standard, but you might want to investigate the literature that also is related to the topic that you were interested in. And so in summary, standards are important in academia, in corporate and government. And I took all this content from what is actually an ANSI site, a site that's sponsored by ANSI called Standards Boost Business. I would suggest that you take a look at it. It's got great information about standards and why they're important. But in academia, standards are everywhere. And so as Paul and Margaret both explained, new graduates who are familiar with standards relevant to their industry will be an asset when they move into industry to their future employers. And in corporate, obviously, standardization is probably very important to ensure quality, safety, and minimize errors, redundancy, and so forth. It obviously has huge commercial impact. And the same thing in government. As Paul also mentioned, some standards are shared internationally. So for instance, you'll see on Compendex that we have standards from the British Standards Institute, ISO, but there are a lot of ISO and IEC standards in there because they're used worldwide. And that's it for today.
Okay.
I welcome any questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Judy. That was great. So next we're going to launch a quick poll. This will give us insight as to how helpful you found today's session, and we want to make sure that we're meeting your needs. Again, if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A. We've got about 6 or 7 questions so far, and I know that Margaret was answering some of them, but if you didn't have the opportunity to read the chat exchange, I'm going to repeat some of them. So if everyone could just indulge me if there is some redundancy here. So the first question is, how do you recommend libraries collect ISO standards so students or users can share in groups? Margaret, I think that was intended
sorry,
for you.
I was on mute there. Yeah, so for ISO standards for sharing in groups for libraries, the way that we do that at Purdue, I can speak to, is we would look, if it wasn't an ISO standard that we already subscribe to in one of our aggregator platforms, so either IHS or TechStreet, we would probably get a quote to see what a multi-user license is for that. And we would add it to one of those platforms for the class to be able to use. That's usually our approach. Now, there are some options with ANSI. They do have some situations where they allow instructors to gain access to a number of ISO and I believe IEC standards for a reduced cost or for free. So if that's something you could work with an instructor to encourage them to look into that program and to reach out to ANSI, and they may be able to get those even at a reduced rate.
Okay, thank you. I think another one for you and Paul. What strategies do you suggest for libraries that don't subscribe to full text standards? I think this may have been addressed in your presentation, but if you could please answer.
Sure, yeah. So I included in the chat an article that has a section on free and low cost access to standards. It's an article that I co-authored with Sarah Huber a few years ago. So if you get a chance, check that out. And there's also an updated link on the NIST website, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, for many free and low cost access to standards. So I encourage you to check those out. There are quite a few STOs that, try to offer programs, to libraries and to educational situations where they're not able to purchase the standards. So that would be one place to look.
Okay, and I don't know if this is a competitive question between two brands, but why do you use both Workbench and TechStreet at Purdue?
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's a great question. That wasn't something we were planning on doing, but a few years ago, we were only using the IHS product. At that time, I believe it was Standards Explorer. But when we were looking at options on TechStreet, one thing I really like about TechStreet is you can get all of the prior versions of the standards at no additional cost. So that was a great thing. But we kept the instance of Engineering Workbench because there is one collection that we're not able to get on TechStreet that our Purdue users really need. I believe it's the ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Organization group of standards. And then I also find it really helpful because I can get quotes from both aggregators pretty quickly if we're looking to add a standard that we don't regularly subscribe to.
Okay.
Mark,
yeah.
This is Judy. Could I also just say something? I just found out actually last week that some of the SDOs have exclusive distribution arrangements with one or the other. So that might be a reason why you might not be able to get certain standards, let's say on TechStreet, because they have an exclusive distribution arrangement with IHS.
Yeah.
Or vice versa.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, Judy. And Judy, here's a question for you. Is there a list of all standard groups on Engineering Village? And then there's a follow-up to that.
All standard groups, meaning all the SDOs that we're covering right now?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, well, that was also in my slides, but I can even give you I can send you, whoever needs that, an Excel spreadsheet showing every single standard record that we have. And I update that periodically. So,
Okay.
yeah, the answer is
Okay.
yes.
And if some are not available because of double listing, for example, IEC 61511 is also listed as ISA/ASNI. Are they listed twice? Are they double listed, or can you only find them in one listing?
You know, I don't know the answer to that, because I do know that there is collaboration between some of the SDOs. So I don't know if, for instance, if we get an IEEE standard, if it's also an ISO standard, if we're also getting it from BSI ISO. But
okay, so if you know it's double listed, should you look for, if you don't find it under IEC, should you then look for it under a different ISO?
Well, in this case, the person asking the question knows the standard ID, so I would search for it that way.
Okay.
And then, yeah.
Okay. And then another one for you, Judy. Does Compendex index all standards provided by a given publisher, or do they cherry pick what they index?
No, we'll take all, so whichever SDO we're working with, we ask for all the standards, and updated weekly or however often, and also the entire archive. So we have all versions.
Okay, and then one last one that I see, unless another comes in. This is for you, Judy. What are the benefits of using Engineering Village for finding and discovering standards as opposed to alternate services?
Well, I think the main benefit is that if you're a user of Compendex, then you're already searching in it for the literature. And then if standards are in there as well as another document type, just like dissertations or books or something else, you'll be able to find the standards alongside the other literature that you were already searching for. And you may not know that a standard exists that's relevant to your subject. And so that we make them discoverable in that way. That's the main benefit.
Okay. Well, those are all the questions that we have. We want to thank everyone for their time, their attention. We really want to thank our presenters for today. You were magnificent, and we really appreciate your generosity and the benefit you brought to everyone who attended today. Our next session